Hello. I guess we'll give a couple seconds for people to get back in the room, and then we'll get started with the first panel today. My name is David Dayen. I am the executive editor of The American Prospect, a magazine about ideas, politics, and power. It's great to be here, and I want to first give thanks to JetBlue for their in-kind donation to this conference by giving me what those in the business call a news peg. And some of you know what I'm talking about. A customer of JetBlue was venting on Twitter X about trying to purchase a ticket to get to a funeral, and the price went up $230 after one day of searching. And he was in despair about this, and then JetBlue's Twitter feed responded to him and said, well, here's what you do. You clear your cache or clear your cookies or go into incognito mode, and that should help you out. Why would he have to do that unless JetBlue was using the browser history showing his searches for flights or maybe hotels or rental cars at the destination? Or who knows, looking at his emails to show that that he's headed to a funeral. That's pretty much surveillance pricing in a nutshell, and it doesn't, from the perspective of this consumer, it certainly doesn't feel like happy experiments to increase access. It feels more like capitalizing on behavior patterns, scarcity, and despair. I first wrote about this in 2024. I actually interviewed JP Dubé, who did that experiment with ZipRecruiter. His co-author now works for ZipRecruiter, by the way. And I did ask him at that, isn't another way of saying 60% got better deals that 40% got ripped off? And they got ripped off so much that it caused a 19% increase in profit. He didn't like that framing. Anyway, I don't want to say that I invented the term surveillance pricing, but I did quote Zephyr Teachout right here, who did invent the term surveillance pricing, because she said it to me during that interview. I have been surprised at the prevalence of this in the last 2 years, just seeing it in the universe. But maybe I shouldn't have been. To hold someone's data is to know their habits, their preferences, their moments of desperation, and that's powerful information to have in the hands of companies. Why wouldn't they use it to do what all businesses see as an imperative, to maximize profits? So we have a terrific set of panelists to talk about this phenomenon. I'm going to go down the line. We have Lindsay Owens, Executive Director of the Groundwork Collaborative, author of the forthcoming blockbuster book, Gouged, The End of a Fair Price and What It Means for Your Wallet. Next, we have Stephanie Nguyen, a senior fellow at the Columbia Law School's Center for Law and the Economy, previously chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. Karen Levy is a faculty member at the Cornell University Department of Information Science and associate faculty at Cornell Law School, with research examining social and organizational implications of data-intensive technologies. And finally, we have Colleen Chien, professor and co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology and a faculty advisor at the Berkeley Center for Consumer Law and Economic Justice. So I think I'll start here with Lindsay, because we actually worked together on this initial story I did in 2024. And one thing we talked about then is that we've had nearly as much time in America with variable pricing as with uniform pricing. And maybe you could go through a little of the history of how we got to uniform pricing in the late 19th century and what the benefits of that were.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's such a fantastic lineup. I really enjoyed the presentation this morning. It's always nice when you spend a lot of time hearing businesses deny using practices like this, to watch a business school professor just lay it out. This is what we teach the students. This is what the CEOs are working with in corporate America today. Look, I think one interesting thing being here in a law school is that the the price tag and the pricing that we've all come to know and maybe love or at least accept over the last 50 years wasn't really a legal invention. It was a cultural and normative one. For thousands of years, haggling was the law of the land, right? And price discrimination was baked in. Maybe it was a skill to haggle and you were good at getting a lower price. Maybe the merchant looked at you and you were wearing a nice tunic and decided he could charge you a little more. Maybe you knew a little something about the merchant and you got a good deal because you had a little something over his head, right? And that was really standard fare for thousands of years. And in the United States context, about 150 years ago, the Quakers decided that haggling was unfair and immoral. They thought every man was created equal under God, every man should pay the same price at the checkout counter. And they started using a standard price. So this is an interesting story that really roots in Pennsylvania in a religious tradition. John Wanamaker, the Philadelphia merchant, takes a look around, sees what the Quakers are up to. He's built the Wanamaker's department store, and he decides to institute the price tag in the United States for the first time. And of course, he was a deeply religious man, and I think was sort of compelled by the arguments that won over the Quakers. But he was also a businessman, and the price tag was efficient, right? Haggling for lipstick, haggling for, a bag of candy, haggling for a pair of shoes. That was going to take a lot of time. He wanted people in and out of the store. So for almost, this diffuses, and for almost 150 years now, we've had a posted price. And the posted price has offered, I think, three things that we have come to take for granted, but that I think are really bedrock to a healthy economy. The first is some fairness and equality. This idea that you and I walked into the store at the same time, we paid the same price for the sweater, right? There wasn't price discrimination between the two of us. It offered some transparency. We knew what the posted price was. Transparency is helpful for comparison shopping. It's helpful for ensuring that prices are competitive. If I'm a budget shopper, I can see price A and price B. I can go to price B. That helps drive down price A, right? And it allowed for some predictability. And predictability is really important for home economics in addition to macroeconomics, right? We know what unpredictability of inflation feels like. But at the household level, knowing how much something is going to cost from week to week, and to get to the issue of surveillance wages, knowing how much you're going to be able to take in from week to week is really essential to clearing your budget, right? To staying in the black. And so there is so much about how pricing has worked for 150 years that's been helpful for families from a home economics perspective, helpful to the economy, keeping prices competitive from a microeconomics perspective, and helping keep prices predictable from a macro perspective. And somehow, and we can talk about how, quietly, without any memorandums going out, although maybe the business school was issuing memorandums on it, this has really eroded over time. And it has picked up in the last few years with the advent of AI. But increasingly, the fair, standard, transparent, predictable price is perhaps becoming a thing of the past. And in its place, all the types of pricing that we can get into: dynamic, surveillance, algorithmic, A/B testing, high-frequency dynamic pricing, right? All of these different types of new ways that companies price in retail settings, in e-commerce settings, but frankly, increasingly in brick-and-mortar settings as well.
Can I add to this?
Yes, please.
I have an addition.
Oh, yeah, you turn it on.
I have an addition to the 150-year excellent history that Lindsay just laid out. And I want to focus on the last 20 years. There are three phases in the past 20 years that I think is important to lay out. It's buried, targeted, and revealed. So there was a normalization era, which I called the buried era, in the early 2000s to 2010s. Think when mobile phones really took off, where people started to say, we're just going to use your data to improve our services. We're going to use your data to improve A/B testing. There was really no clear line between UX optimization and revenue. Then you're moving into this sort of the targeted era of the 2010s, where we're not targeting individuals. This is just optimization. So in this era, this was the birth of the CVS extra bucks receipt. I'm talking about the 17-foot long piece of paper that reveals surveillance pricing in that moment. Like, they showed you everything you bought. They showed you things you might want. The fact that they knew that you had a kid and that was sick and that you would probably come back in the next 2 days for some Pedialyte. This was the era of data mining, of inferred signals. And then you keep moving on to the 2020s, which is now, and I call this the reckoning era, where invisible becomes more visible. And you see this happen, you've seen it happen with dark patterns, where all of a sudden you have armies of academics and researchers and savants out there, like lifting up rocks, creating names for the bad practices that people just like feel so ripped off about. And so in this moment, I'm just so excited to be here because so many people in this room have contributed to this sort of tapestry of robust evidence that is growing and growing and growing, which gives a lot of regulators and policymakers and lawmakers the ability to actually move on this and take action.
My favorite version of that is the woman who found out she was pregnant from CVS because she was getting ads for products for being a new mother before she even knew she was about to be a new mother.
Can I just throw in quickly?
This is great. I don't have to ask a question at all. Go ahead.
David, you can sit down.
Yeah, sounds good.
I just wanted to shout out one of Steph's pieces. Steph has this excellent piece in the Yale Law Review, Harvard, one of the good ones, about not as good
Berkeley's
as Cal.
also a good one.
But there's a lot of good ones about targeted pricing and its evolution from targeted advertising that I think it's you know what I'm saying. You wrote it.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, back with catalogs. And,
Yeah, which I think
Yeah.
it's like such a sharp. Like, you should read it if you haven't.
Read it. Wow. Yeah.
Of course I read it. But you should read it if you haven't. And I think it calls out some of what I think we can see in the history that Lindsay has highlighted and that Stephanie has highlighted, which is that, like, given that these are not new dynamics, there's a very interesting newness about the feeling of the dynamics that I think we are experiencing now. Like, there's this sudden kind of convergence of interest among policymakers, among the public, et cetera. And I think what Stephanie helped me realize through that piece is that that's because, right, like, you see this kind of convergence of several things that have bothered people for a long time that are now they come to like some perfect storm in the context of surveillance pricing, which is surveillance capitalism, which we've been talking about for quite a while, and which I think we're very familiar with, that personal data becomes the medium of exchange in a really in a very disempowering way for everyday consumers. Price differentiation, which has been with us for a very long time, sometimes problematically, sometimes less so, right, but is being called out in this different set of ways. And then a point that Park made, I thought really compellingly, which is just about the automation and speed with which all of these things occur, which just intensifies things that maybe were already problematic that we kind of didn't pay that much attention to because they happen slowly, and maybe causes some new normative concerns just by virtue of the increased opacity that the speed creates. So,
well, Stephanie also wrote a paper with Sam Levine, who's in the audience here, about loyalty programs and how that's a tool to extract data. And I want to talk about that eventually, but I also want to thank the Chamber of Progress, which is a lobbying group run by an ex-Google executive who came out today, this is another in-kind donation to this conference, came out today with a campaign called More Ways to Save, which frames surveillance pricing as primarily offering discounts, coupons, and loyalty program offers. And I want to discuss this, and Colleen, maybe I'll bring you in. Are these tools just being used to more intensely compete for a shopper's business? So should we all go home? Is this just about giving discounts to people?
So I think it raises a really good question, and I wanted to just comment also on the wide variety of tactics that are being used, right? It's not just pricing. So we're focusing today on pricing and wages, but there's so many other ways to accomplish extraction, and they've been there and they will continue to be there. And so I think that we need to figure out what is going to be what is the point at which we the intervention is necessary, and how far can we get with just focusing right now on pricing? Because there, again, if you close off the pricing ability people to price differently, they can use couponing, they can use sort of ad load disparities, other things to achieve the same aims. And so, again, I think that we do want to make space for some of the positive benefits of inclusion or the ability to get a wider variety of people to be able to uptake a product. And then I think that is also important to be part of that balance in that discussion as well.
Anyone else want to take this? Like, is this a problem? What's wrong with the discount?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm a big fan of discounts and deals, and the next biggest fan of discounts and deals in this room is Sam Levine, because he wrote that paper with me, and we were like, we cannot imagine a position that would be better to take other than to make sure that we defend the American deal and the discount. I think the reason why this really stood out to us was because, interestingly enough, a lot of these discount, promo, loyalty plan deals are really a Trojan horse way to collect unfettered access to a ton of demographic, behavioral details, extremely granular details like your mouse movements, your clicks. Sam was sending me that, Target was updating their privacy policy. I did a diff on the two and found that they added in voice prints and biometric data. And so, this is just like constantly the rug is getting pulled out from underneath us every day and changing because these policies are changing. And I don't want to get ahead of David here, but I do think, in terms of like one of the biggest challenges ahead, it's this question of defending the discount. And what does it mean to actually defend the discount without actually allowing companies to surveil you and raise prices?
I mean, one of the ways that you know that this is important, this is something I think, Lindsay, you've written about a lot, is that there's been this proliferation of pricing consultants that are selling the idea of optimizing price. We've seen companies that promise, for example, to help aggregate the total amount of data in a particular market, total amount of prices in a particular market, so that they can coordinate those prices upward, things like RealPage and AgriStats. I'm wondering how these pricing consultants that talk about price optimization, are they really any different than these other companies which have been sued for illegal price fixing?
Yeah, one of the fun things that I got to do in the course of writing the book is I researched the history of pricing advisors and pricing consultants and the sort of rise of these pricing technology companies. And they really come about after deregulation, right? When we had price controls in a lot of industries, CEOs didn't need a lot of help with pricing because the government offered quite a bit of it. And as they start to figure out themselves how to price, they enlist this kind of cadre of economists who realize it's big business and then set up consulting firms like Simon Kucher and Associates, which is one of the big pricing firms. Now there is a real cottage industry of pricing tech companies. Many of them are AI companies. David mentioned JetBlue, so I'll talk about one of my favorite pricing tech companies, Flyer, F-L-Y-R, no vowels in Silicon Valley.
You're not allowed to have
no
any
vowels.
You can't, they're too expensive. You have to buy them. You have to buy a vowel.
Right. So Flyer actually starts out as a kind of cool consumer-facing company that's going to help you lock in an airline fare. So you could sort of buy the right to hold a fare for a week. But as they start working in the airline space, they realize that there's actually a lot more money to be made in deploying what they're learning in the consumer space in the business-to-business space. And they become a service for the big airlines. Peter Thiel invests in this in 2019. He sees the possibility right away. One of their big initial clients, Virgin Atlantic. And then JetBlue. So what are they doing for JetBlue? They're providing real-time revenue management services, just like the ones that Park outlined this morning. They are tracking what consumers are doing on the JetBlue website, when they're buying a flight, when they're hovering over a flight, when they're holding on a flight, and they're getting better and better and better at figuring out exactly the maximum point each customer is willing to pay. We don't know exactly everything that's under the hood of the flyer algorithm, but we do know that they say that they offer personalized offerings. One of the things they help companies like JetBlue do. And we know that JetBlue was so interested in Flyer when they started their partnership with them that JetBlue's venture capital arm ultimately invested in Flyer's success with seed capital. You may have heard about a similar company, Fetcher, last summer when Delta at one of their investor days talked about how exciting they were, or how excited they were, and how much profit they were bringing in with their new partnership with an AI pricing tech company called Fetcher. Delta got in a lot of trouble for this. American really seized on it and said they wouldn't be doing personalized pricing or surveillance pricing. But it was a really great news cycle for Fetcher. They actually ended up raising another Series C round right after the news broke, because a lot of businesses took a look at what Fetcher was able to do for Delta with their pricing software and said, "Hey, I'm interested in trying that out as well." So they're now expanding into the gaming sector, into the financial services sector, and more. So just one example of these new AI pricing tech companies. Part of the reason that we knew to take a peek at Instacart is we had actually uncovered, as we were researching the history of pricing advisors and pricing consultants, a company called Eversight. Eversight was the A/B testing platform that Instacart acquired in early 2021 that built the machinery of the A/B testing that the Consumer Reports and Groundwork study exposed.
I should say that we are going to definitely get to questions at the end of this panel. So if I believe you have note cards there, you can write down questions. Somebody will come around, pick them up, and we'll get to them. So it's clear technology is a key accelerant of these practices. But another thing that I think, and Karen, maybe you can take this, that's important is the isolation of the customer. If I'm in line and I see someone paying $3 and I'm paying $4, I'm going to be mad. But if I don't know that they're paying $3 and I'm paying $4, then I'm not going to be as mad because I won't know anything. So talk about that aspect of it. How important is isolation, and what technologies and practices are being used to ensure that isolation?
Yeah, I mean, thanks to Lindsay, among other researchers, for helping to provide some counter to that isolation by giving us some common knowledge about what prices people are being paid, and certainly, on the wage side, collective action to try to reveal what differences there are on the wage side as well, right? Is one of the things that I think is really critical to help prevent this sort of information asymmetry between workers or consumers and firms. One of the things that I think the isolation contributes to is this sort of generalized sense of like ick that we have around surveillance pricing. Somebody used this phrase yesterday, and I forget who it was, but I'm stealing the ick phrase. One of the things that we've been thinking about, and I want to quickly call out Travis Lloyd, who is my PhD student, who's right there. Shout out to Travis. Travis and I are working on 3 cheers for Travis. Yay. Travis and I are working on a paper together, along with some colleagues, for the Symposium issue, and the paper is called "What's Wrong with Surveillance Pricing?" And I realized that that phrasing makes it sound like maybe our answer is nothing, which is not our answer. But instead it's that, I think in part because of this isolation, and in part because, there's this general sense that there's something gross about what's happening here, something exploitative or something manipulative or something privacy invasive. Consumers, I think, when confronted with practices like the JetBlue practice, or the ones that, do rise to the level of public recognition, which is probably not most of them, think like, well, that's gross. Like, I don't want that. That doesn't feel fair to me. That doesn't feel appropriate to me. But then when you actually try to dig into what it is that's normatively problematic about the practice, there's kind of like a big mix of issues. So like the work that we want to do is to try to untangle conceptually, like what are the various objections that we might have to surveillance pricing. And the reason to do that, I think, is because to formulate responsive policy, we need to know, like, is this something that offends us, even if it's a net benefit to consumers in the aggregate? It may be that the answer is yes, right? If it leads to the kind of privacy invasive practices that Stephanie alludes to. Is the problem market manipulation? Is the problem exploitation of people's vulnerability? Is the problem opacity or speed that prevents people from planning? I mean, the answer can be all of these things, but I think if we can't clearly articulate like what it is that makes us feel gross about this, then we're actually not well equipped to formulate policies that are responsive to those gross feelings.
Yeah. I mean, there is, we're seeing dramatic drops in consumer sentiment. I mean, the current consumer sentiment is worse than the Great Recession or the depths of COVID right now. And I feel like you have to attribute some of that to a pervasive sense that you're constantly being ripped off. I remember Lena Khan telling me, like, the consumer has to actually do battle in order to live their life. And they have to guard against all of these things. Do you feel like, and anyone can take this, do you feel like that's like a part of why consumers are feeling stressed right now?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that the lived experience of people now getting more aware of the practices, and actually, a lot of my students who started learning about this in sort of the AI class that I teach start to experience this just in their day to day. And so I think that that's what's been one of the big drivers of, I would say, legislative attention, because people can understand themselves and have that, how unfair it is that you're getting a different price than somebody else. So I think things like the disclosure rule in New York, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, even if it, some certain people may not be able to change their behavior, it does at least provide an accountability mechanism for these companies, because as Park said, consumers don't like it. There's backlash when it's reported. You can't report on every single company in terms of what it's doing, but if the disclosure is there, then at least people are aware and they can take action. So I think that that's really important. It's just the accountability. And I guess what I wonder is the companies who've like stepped away, like American Airlines, that says we're not going to personalize, or Burger King, like what are they doing instead? Are they then just sending coupons or doing other kinds of, optimization in terms of how search results are displayed? I'm skeptical that they're stepping back entirely from surveillance capitalism, but at least it is an accountability mechanism that I think is really important.
One really interesting thing is Americans have really strongly held beliefs that are actually really nuanced and really coherent about fair pricing. And of course, surveillance pricing, it makes sense that we don't like it, right? It's this intersection of being spied on and being gouged or overcharged. I mean, what could be worse, right? But it turns out that, let's talk about the World Cup, for example, right? There are a few different ways you can price scarce resources, right? One is that you can auction them off to the highest bidder. And that's what FIFA is doing right now. And the result is sky-high World Cup tickets. But there are other ways to ration scarce resources. You can run a lottery system where everyone has a perfectly equal chance of getting access to a ticket. You can have a queue. I am old enough to have stood in line for concert tickets, and not buying them online. And the first, it wasn't the case that if you were the last person in line to get a ticket, that they changed the price of the ticket. You just got the last ticket at the posted price, right? Well, economists love an auction, but we know from public opinion research and behavioral economics experiments, Americans trust a line, right? We have a different way of seeing fairness in pricing. If you look at the experiments that Kahneman and Thaler ran in the 80s, there's this large body of behavioral economics. It was the basis of their dual entitlement theory. It's actually really interesting. Across cultures, across scenarios, at every point in time, Americans really prefer cost plus pricing. They say it is totally reasonable for the merchant to make back everything they put into this product, all of their input costs, And it is reasonable for them to turn a profit. Nobody is expecting these companies to break even. But when you start varying and deviating from cost plus pricing, charging more just because you can, because it's a snowstorm and you got the last snow shovel, Americans don't like it. If you ask people, if you tell people that there's gonna be a price increase, like because of tariffs, and the company goes ahead and increases prices on the goods that were imported before the duties applied, people don't like that either, right? Across the board, there's sort of a coherent sense of how fair pricing works, and it effectively is cost plus pricing. I mean, I think it's why the Mark Cubans of the world have settled in on that as their approach. It's very popular with Americans. It's their preferred way of engaging with pricing in retail.
I want to go back to Professor Park's 20-piece chicken McNuggets example. If you guys remember the side-by-side, that's really a visceral example of something that I'm sure we have all seen, where some people might say it's just a few dollars or it's just a few cents difference. Why is it that big of a deal? In aggregate, the markets are more efficient, the businesses are more efficient. At the end of the day, I'll be fine with just 17 cents additional cost to my bill. But I think if we bring back this moment of reckoning and what Lindsay and others are describing here, pricing is broken. The ability to price compare does not exist right now. And I think, you see the examples of that one slide with the McNuggets, but every tiny transaction that you do like that adds up. How many times you buy something in a day, in a week, over time, in a year? And I think debunking these myths that people are bringing to allow this pricing and these practices to continue is, I think, the moment we're in. We need to attack.
That's interesting, though, because I think what you hear, just go back to the Chamber of Progress, I guess, is that, everyone has a comparison shopping tool in their pocket. That, we can figure this out. We can fight fire with fire, tech with tech. Do you think people can price shop their way out of this situation?
Has anyone tried to buy a big screen TV before? Please raise your hand. Okay, so if you try to search for a big screen TV right now, search Samsung 4G something. First of all, if you actually try to do a side-by-side of Walmart, Best Buy, Amazon, Target, all the big box retailers, what you're gonna see is the title of the TV is incoherent and not the same, because the title is 25 words long. It has 4G plus warranty, 2026, right? There's all these different words. The model numbers, some retailers change one digit in the model number and have a distinct model number. Then you try to put it in the cart, and then you realize that not only are the prices different, but the packages are different, because one comes with the 2-year warranty, one comes with a free credit card, one comes with other things like that. And then like Professor Park showed, the fun little Walmart guy pops up on your bottom left screen. Yeah, Sparky. And you can talk to that person. I actually did that with all these retailers. And you know what I found? Number one, a lot of these big box retailers are selling you credit cards on them. You can ask them for discounts. One of them actually sent me to call the phone number to ask if I can have a lower price. And so, again, this sort of concept of what is a price does not exist today.
Yeah. So I guess the personal responsibility angle of this maybe isn't going to work. So,
And I think there's also there's kind of a distributional angle to that as well. Those who are savvy, the richest will come up with their agentic bots who are going to shop and get great deals and be really patient and come up with amazing pricing and use different tricks and figure out how to call and get a discount. And those who are in a state of precarity or busy, sort of working Americans are not necessarily going to be able to access this. So I think you're going to have this sort of false idea that tech is going to be able to be a leveler. It could be even a more exacerbate the differences even more.
One
extremely.
interesting example I remember seeing is Staples was pricing online shoppers more if there weren't hardware stores in their neighborhood. So that's more of the precarity angle that you were going towards. I believe Sparky is, there's a desire to talk more about Sparky, so go ahead.
Okay. Since Park brought up Sparky, Sparky is really interesting and I think emblematic of the next wave of surveillance pricing, which is sort of where things are going with chatbots. In Walmart's earnings call just this past quarter, they identified that they're getting 35% boosts in revenue from people who use Sparky. And that's in part because Sparky is the closer. They are making sure that if you put something in your cart, Sparky is moving you to checkout, right? It is pushing you over that line, making sure you get it before it's gone. But I think just in general, there is this new concern that the types of information that you're sharing with Sparky about your desires for something are going to start impacting price. And the types of I think of it as sort of like proxy behavioral data that companies have been using to infer your intentions. Now they will just be able to ask you what your intentions and desires are and start to use that data. And I think as we saw when Google introduced their Universal Commerce Protocol, the plan is for real integration of user-generated conversational data from your conversations with chatbots, as well as information that they collect from you in other settings, as well as data that they buy from third parties, all being integrated into pricing models. And I think there are real concerns here about who the chatbot works for when you shop in AI. Does it work for you? Does it work for the retailer? Does it work for Google in the case of UCP? And these are agents. And so since I'm in a room full of lawyers, I'll throw out that I think there's an interesting kind of idea here that your chatbot has to work for you and no one else, right?
Fiduciary duty of the chat.
Yeah. I mean, I think you should at a minimum know that your chatbot isn't working on your behalf. Your agent isn't working on your behalf if you're shopping,
that gets us into a good place, which is regulatory solutions. By last July, 24 states had introduced some legislation on technology-aided pricing. There's a bill. There's obviously the law in New York State, which is disclosure-based. There's also a bill on the desk of Governor Westmore in Maryland. I want to go through, ask everybody this question. What would a regulatory regime that deals with surveillance pricing, what should it look like? And we can just start back to front here.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is, again, to see what has been proposed and then what actually has gotten over the finish line. We talked about the New York bill in terms of disclosure. I can talk a little bit about the Maryland bill. The Maryland bill is interesting, I think, because it does reflect a little of this duality of we are worried about surveillance pricing, especially, and that bill focuses on grocery store settings. And I think, I think a lot of people are happy that the bill's passed, but say that it's watered down a lot because it is only focused on that setting. I think it's that the AG, public prosecutors can bring actions, but that individuals cannot. And I think there are carve-outs. This is similar to what's being proposed in California as well. So there is the sense still that we want to preserve some ability for companies to continue to, sort of have non-uniform pricing in the vein of what Park talked about earlier as being beneficial. But when we're talking about necessity goods, we're talking about goods where people don't really have options, right? And they're more likely to be in a state of needing to buy that product then at that moment, not being able to have a lot of options, and maybe certain consumers having fewer options than others. That there is that space that we want to hold sacred. In California, we again had a bunch of bills that were proposed last year. The one that got over the finish line weren't on surveillance pricing specifically. They were focused on antitrust regulation and how we could regulate, I think it was the Cartwright Act that became more fortified, collusion, right, with common pricing algorithms and looking at antitrust as being a really strong tool. But again, we'll see what happens in this cycle, but we've, are seeing another, I think, desire to start with something broad, but then again, even the bill that is being proposed now that's coming back has a lot of carve out. So there is the preservation of loyalty programs. You know, even though they are very extractive in terms of getting information, people still really like them. People like programs where if it's, you know, a student or senior discount or something, we want to preserve that ability. So I think that there is this duality and still concern about, I don't know that we'll see a full-fledged ban of all surveillance pricing in any of the states. It feels like the compromises are coming, you know, through the process because of the duality of the consumer interest here.
Karen, what's your optimal regime here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, two quick things. One, I think it's important that we not conflate disclosure, transparency, and meaningful, actionable information for consumers into one thing, right? Disclosure is fine, but disclosure doesn't necessarily enable the kind of comparison shopping that like Groundwork's work, like it doesn't reveal to you what's going on with other people, which is really critical. And it doesn't necessarily put you in a position to make a different choice as a consumer. It responsibilizes consumers without giving them the tools necessarily to act on that. So I'm like wary of relying on that as a wholesale solution. I'm excited. I think I'm most excited about, to Colleen's point, some of the legislative action or regulatory action that focuses on exploitation, manipulation, and unconscionability, just because those to me feel like sort of thicker tools to engage with you know, the real harms that can result from this, and to actually ensure that either the worst practices are disallowed or that don't necessarily rely on consumers who I just don't think are in the best, they're not positioned in order to like have to be responsible for preventing these practices or protecting themselves from them.
Stephanie, I just want to ask this in a certain context. Do you think that what's important is cracking down on the worst practices or the data collection that enables them?
I think we should think about this in 4 different ways to sort of deconflate. Number one, if we think about it in terms of the erosion of competition and power asymmetries, like if you're on Amazon, search for coffee and the entire first row is all sponsored. Like it's very hard to tell, right? People need to consider structural separation. A business line separation between the platform and the marketplace. The fact that Amazon can sell its own products and fill the entire first page with its own products. Number 2 is like value extraction and price bloat tactics. So this is all like junk fees and ways to like shrinkflation and that type of thing. A fixed all-in publicly advertised price or discount that is uniformly available as opposed to, you know, a backpack that is targeted to someone who shops at the dollar store within a certain age range. Number 3 is touching on what you're saying, which is the differential treatment and data abuses. And for that, I think we need to be looking at very clean bans on data used for estimating willingness to pay, used for estimating demand. This is like search and browser history. Do we need to collect that? Biometric data and eyeball movements. Third-party data aggregation to create profiles, is this required? And then the final one is sort of what these guys are talking about is consumer confusion and manipulation and friction. Are there ways to restrict frequency of detailed pricing changes on electronic shelf labels or require disclosures of a price?
Great. And then go ahead.
Yeah, I'll quickly add 2 things, and I'm going to take it up to the like 50,000 foot level here. For me, there's really one principle that should guide our thinking here, and it's that it is not the consumer's job to bob and weave and duck and dodge and figure out how to beat the machine. And so that should be where we start. We shouldn't be developing policy and regulatory tools to make it easier for consumers to duck and dodge. They shouldn't be ducking and dodging in the first place. The second thing I'll say is I'm worried that actually all of these policy solutions that we're currently proposing, however important and however much progress they'll make, are too limited. In my view, we are at a precipice where it is time to rewrite the basic contract and the basic bargain between shoppers and retailers for the digital era. And all of the policies that many folks in this room care about should be part of rewriting that bargain. It is not just junk fees and surveillance pricing. It is how we think about right to repair. It is how we think about refunds and the right to get a refund without talking to 15 chatbots for a week and a half. There is a sort of, I think, higher calling for us in the way that JFK proposed his Consumer Bill of Rights many years ago, that we should be taking to approach this. And I worry that some of our policy solutions, however important, feel ticky-tacky, and we need to be thinking bigger and broader about what the contract should be between shoppers and retailers in digital commerce.
To that point, and then we'll get to questions that I have here from the audience, I sometimes get concerned that the personalized part of personalized pricing could actually be dropped. That if you have enough data, if you have enough machine learning, that you could use billions of experiments and aggregated data to price. And I don't know if that's really any better, even though it might feel better. But I want to go to the questions from the audience. If others have some, send one down, but I have a bunch here. First one is, should we ban or regulate electronic shelf labels? Would that help? Signed, a concerned consumer. And I'll give that to anybody.
Oh, yeah.
It was indeed. Anyone want to take that?
I mean, I think that's been one of the fronts of the regulations you've seen. I don't know, I can't remember the specific states, but I think particularly with respect to like pharmaceutical goods. I mean, I think that yes, I mean, I think especially for retail pricing, just the machinery of that being there is, invites abuse, and you can imagine people sort of biometric information and others being used, and it's just like how can that be a good thing in that particular context? There may be reasons for electronic shelf labels that have not to do with price changes that are individualized, but could be seasonal. I think there's some regulation around like only one price change per day or something along those lines. So there could be some sort of measures along those lines. But generally speaking, I think the principle that yes, you should be able to go into a store and see what the price is, and that should stay consistent for whoever comes in, is something that we could commit to. And then, so yeah, again,
All right.
I would want to understand better what the case for the labels are in the first place. But
Stephanie, you
again,
had something on this?
Is there a Walmart near Berkeley? No. Okay. Well, I was going
We're in Berkeley, you realize.
Okay. I spent 4 hours at a Walmart shopping around because they're the store that's piloting and has like over 2,000 of their stores that actually have it in place. And what was interesting is that what you would imagine, right, is like you go into a store and like you see flickering, changing prices all the time, and it's this weird dystopian place. But what I actually found was that when you're in the store and there's like a little QR code on the digital shelf label, you realize that the prices are actually weirdly different on the different platforms that Walmart offers. So like the shelf shows a price, but maybe the physical tag says something different. The in-store price versus the in-app price is different versus the logged in versus not. So again, I kind of want to broaden this point, and then the discounts and the rollbacks are different depending on which platform you're looking at.
Right. All right, I got another question. We touched on this a little bit. Is there any data on whether price surveillance helps low-wage consumers versus preys on them? And then as a corollary, should we just outlaw this type of behavior and let the other stuff continue? I think she means preying on lower-wage consumers. Is it arguably progressive? It can, if you can pay more, then you do so.
hopefully Lindsay's group will be working on that first question a little more with respect to looking at profiles of people and I don't know if you guys were able to understand what drove some people to see higher or lower Instacart prices.
Yeah, we actually didn't find any demographic variation in the Instacart study. It's been interesting to see a lot of people characterize it as surveillance pricing, but it really was just the kind of high frequency A/B testing and experimentation that Park identified. And there were, from what we identified, there were effectively 5 experimental conditions, 5 kind of clusters of prices that were offered to different shoppers for different products.
Right. Yeah, please, Karen.
Yeah, just, also to one of Park's points, right? The idea that business travelers pay a lot more for their airfares because they're getting reimbursed by companies anyway, I don't think is inherently the thing that keeps a lot of us up at night, right? I think if
Right.
something is progressive in its effects, We tend to not be as worried about it. That said, look at a context like healthcare costs, right, which is like much more complicated than a lot of the consumer contexts we've been talking about now, where we might say, okay, well, if there's an insurer, there are intermediaries, there are going to be much higher prices. And it may be that the effects of that are progressive, but the other effect of that is like an absolute morass of opacity and inability for consumers to have any idea how much it is they're paying for medical services,
Right.
such that there can be harms even if I think the net effect is economic.
And then there's the other end of the spectrum, the Staples example of people literally in low-wage settings being charged more.
Well, the healthcare example I love because so many of the surveillance pricing bills carve out insurance and financial regulation. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. But one of them is presumably because people have bought into this idea that insurers and folks who price credit need information about us to price credit and insurance effectively. There's a business case for this type of surveillance. But the truth is actually that in many cases, these companies are going well beyond the business case in what they look at about us and how they use it in pricing. And we have actually decided that despite the fact that there was a business case for health insurance companies to charge certain people with certain family histories more, we weren't going to let them. That was a critical piece of the Affordable Care Act. And so, again, to my point about how we have to go bigger with some of these policies, I think there's a strong case that these insurance markets have gotten out of control with some of the surveillance pricing practices that they use.
That touches on literally something that I got as another question. Has anyone on the panel looked at the use of surveillance pricing in financial services, which is where, I would argue opacity of information or financial literacy, if you will, can be a big factor potentially. Anyone have anything on that?
I haven't looked at that. One of the, this is somewhat tangential, but I thought that the work that the CFPB was doing, and maybe, Seth or something could weigh in, to look at some of how financial service firms and employers were using different models for paying workers, where they would have to use different types of payroll cards and things like that, and they would take different amounts out of different customers' paychecks based on the type of credit card that you would get, your payroll card that you would get your wages on. I was interested in learning more about that, and I know that the Trump administration stopped that program, but I think there were some interesting things going on there with low wage workers and access to their payroll, and some interesting questions about surveillance wages there too.
I do remember that Plexure, which is the company that the McDonald's app uses, was looking at financial information in targeting its prices, including what day you got paid. And so maybe the discounts aren't as discounted on that day. Here's another question from front of the room from Zephyr Teachout. Doesn't this actually call into question the entire marginal pricing revolution? Because as the panel has noted, the value for a consumer is endogenous, not pre-existing, but created by the system. Don't all jump into one.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's this kind of, there's a few things to say about this. One is, to my earlier point about how Americans like cost plus pricing. Non-Americans, like these studies were replicated globally. Increasingly, I think what really frustrates Americans about these different types of pricing models is that the pricing is untethered from the underlying cost of making the good almost entirely, and instead is being decided almost entirely based on your willingness to pay, right? Your personal demand. And so I think that is the ick, right? In some respects. And I think it really does belie what we were all told about how pricing works, in introductory economics courses, right?
I think, to the extent that we think about a, quote, revealed price as somehow closer to God or, something like that, right? Like it's in my soul, I want these headphones for $26. Like the way you put it is absolutely dead on, I think, right? Like that's a sort of meaningless of course, it's endogenous to the system in which people find themselves. I feel like we've known this about privacy for a very long time, right? When people talk about privacy preferences, and isn't it paradoxical how people say they love privacy, but then they act in ways where they don't protect their own privacy? And if you stop and think about it for 2 seconds, you realize how ridiculous that is, right? Like, people act in the way they must act to live their lives.
Right.
And the same with market behavior. I mean, there's no reason to assume that there would be some purity to revealed preference.
Right. Here's another question. The question is, how can consumers get to know that they're being under surveillance, and then presumably that it's being used to price them? This questioner brings up the Freedom of Information Act, which I'm not sure totally applies, but how can we know? What can consumers do to know about the extent to which surveillance pricing is being exhibited upon them?
Well, the New York law is a gift in that sense, and there could be more done, I think, just to collect information about who actually is putting those disclosures out. We did a little work sort of among some of the New York folks who had graduated from Berkeley but were in New York, just to kind of look at different products, and after the law went into effect, after the sort of legal challenge was lifted, trying to figure out where exactly we saw the disclosures. And it was mostly in what you would expect in terms of retail, Uber. It wasn't every single area, but I think just more information, more education is useful. And then I think also just getting a sense of whether there could be some sort of mass experiment. I know that Steph is now part of a new center at Columbia, and New York, you guys could do more to potentially come up with these personas and try to monitor what different prices people are seeing, so we could see whether or not there was correlation between certain profiles and certain outcomes. Again, because that those were being set with surveillance pricing. We don't have that information here. That's something that New York, I think there's a lot that can be done with that new disclosure that's taking place.
Okay, I have 2 more questions here that are kind of similar about the limits, what limits you can set on this behavior. One is, I'm curious how much the problem centers on the surveillance aspect versus the opportunity to gouge. If we set regulation that permitted dynamic discounts, would this be more acceptable? And then the other question, which is similar, how would this change if the models were not about the maximum someone would pay and about the genuine ability to repay? And this is, the reference here is the Truth in Lending Act, for example.
I mean, this is where I think the framework, the 4-part framework that I laid out, like competition, price bloat, differential treatment and data abuses, and then confusion and manipulation, is a useful framework to start from. Because if you latch on to one of those first, like what you're describing as what do you do because of it is slightly different. And so that was my attempt at trying to distill it. But I do think the things worth pushing on for the scholars and academics and students in the room is, number one, rethinking consent. It doesn't exist in the consumer context. It definitely doesn't exist in the worker context, right? Why are we still talking about it, and what do we do about it? And number 2, opt out. The fact that most of the the privacy laws say okay, consumers can opt out. What does that actually look like? And should we reconsider these norms?
I'll add another thing. When you were at the FTC, there were some cases in which the FTC labeled certain types of data collection itself as an unfair practice. How could that be used or expanded to look at this problem?
Yeah, I'll give kudos to Sam Levine, who sued a bunch of data brokers and was leading the charge there, but we helped. And I think definitely a ton of stuff to learn here. Look up the Data Broker Toolkit, which Sam, Erie, and I had put out, because what we did is pull together the dozens of data broker cases together and highlighted all the remedies that we brought because of it. And to your point, there are bans on collecting certain data, bans on collecting data for advertising.
If you're in California, you can take advantage of the new drop option that's out there and delete basically the data that's being held by data brokers I think that went into effect earlier this year, but that's a
Could you
universal
expand on
opt-out.
that? What is that?
So it's a new option and toolkit.
As a Californian.
Go online.
Asking for a Californian.
Yes, you can go online and you can basically opt out of your data being retained by data brokers by going online. If you look up Cal Privacy Drop, yeah. I don't actually have the website address, but you can look it up and you can basically opt out of having your data collected. Now, again, that doesn't mean an individual platform. You know, if you have a loyalty program or an app on your phone, that data can still be retained. But the transfer that data to a data broker and that keeping of the data there, that's what you can basically opt out of.
I just want
Go
to
ahead. We gotta
add
wrap it up.
something.
We got 1 minute. So.
Add something really quick on the question that's been kind of like percolating under the surface in a few of these questions, which is sort of this idea that there could be something sort of inherently pro-social about surveillance pricing if just used by the good guys, right? The Robin Hood of it all, right? We could overcharge the wealthy and we could use it to offer discounts to the poor. And I think there are just a couple of things to highlight here. The first is, look, the American economy features more robber barons than Robin Hoods, right? And I think, left to their own devices, that's where this lands, not as a pro-social device, but as a revenue maximizing one. But the second thing to say about this is, cost cutting in the United States has hit bone, right? They've busted all the unions, they've outsourced all the jobs, they've gigified the other ones. We're in a price hiking era in the United States, and inflation has made that doubly true. And so these technologies are going to be used to bring in more revenue through price hikes, not through discounts. And as much as the Chamber of Progress wants to run around saying that they're spending millions of dollars to preserve discounts, they're spending millions of dollars to preserve price increases. And that's the era that we're in. And it's the era that we're going to be in for the foreseeable future. And so I just think it's like worth us all understanding that and sort of baking that into our brains, because there are these sort of, fun intellectual conversations about the pro-social benefits of something like this. But then there's where the rubber meets the road, what it's going to look like in practice. And what it's going to look like in practice is people paying more and desperate people paying most.
On that cheery note, we are going to wrap it up. I thought this was a great panel. Thank you to all the panelists.